All right, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Don Taylor, and welcome to PLP Pathways webinar number 7. Today, we're going to be revisiting equity, and if my collaborators would introduce themselves, I would appreciate it. Start with Lindsay, and we'll go right down the row.
Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay Hallman, and I work for Up for Learning as the executive director.
Maura?
Hi, I'm Maura Wheeler. I'm the Proficiency-Based Learning and Technology Integration Coach at Lamoille South.
Hi, I'm Kevin Peely-Hunt. I'm a 5'8" journalist on Swift House at Wilson Central School.
All right, and so we've talked about equity and issues of equity for most of the year, and we've tried to weave those issues into our webinars and to put those issues on the forefront of educators' minds. And one of the resources that we've been using quite a bit, Paul Gorski's work on the EdChange website, including the equity literacy framework, and then also 10 commitments for equity literate educators. And I guess it would be great just to hear sort of from each of us where you are in your equity work and what you're thinking about and how it's going and how you think it's perhaps changed, if it has changed, things you're doing in your learning or workspace. And I'll start with anybody who wants to volunteer about how equity concerns have influenced your thinking this year.
I can start.
Yep.
So we, this year, as just the 5 facilitators in Swift House, took a really purposeful approach to teaching about equity and social justice and getting our kids really involved with it. So we actually spent some time talking with Kyle and Andrea over at Orleans and took a lot of their resources that they had already had established there. And the way we do our groupings on Swift House, we run kind of these 12-session, about 4-week-long literature groups where we give students about 8 to 9 different choices of literature books. We typically have some sort of theme that we cover, and those are true 5-8 groupings. And then that meets 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then Tuesday and Thursday we have 5th and 6th grade writing groups and 7th and 8th grade writing groups. So our focus for this specific unit was all about social justice. And like I said, we looked at, spent some time looking through the Orleans resources that Kyle and Andrea had created, and it's been incredible. The conversations that we've been having with these kids and just having them really open up and just for me, it's just like having that dialogue has been outstanding. Kids have been giving us some really great feedback. So all of our literature books that we're doing all have some sort of equity theme. And again, we were trying to be really purposeful in terms of covering the whole range. So it's not like all about race or all about socioeconomic. So we really had a pretty diverse range of books. And it's the first time I think we've really been super, super purposeful about this work and intentional about it. And it's just been outstanding in terms of, like I said, the conversations that have come of it and the questions kids are asking and hearing what they've been talking about. It was like a light bulb for us. Like, we need to do more of this and not just have this be just a unit, but really make sure that this language now is part of our everyday, culture on our team. So it's we have a ton of resources. I've been trying to post on our Instagram and Twitter just about like the kind of daily things we're doing with picture book read alouds that have to do with some equity focus and different things that we're doing. Again, for me, it keeps me honest in terms of, sharing out and showing what we're doing. I think it's just great too for, I know I appreciated when Kyle and Andrea were sharing the things that they were doing in their class. So we've been trying to push stuff out there for other teachers to look at and say, hey, here's what we did on Swift. If you want to try it out, and if you want to tweak it, by all means, go for it.
That's awesome. Lindsay?
Yeah, I think a thread that I can pick up on is this idea that I'm going to talk from a different context because I work in the nonprofit world, but I work with youth and adult teams in schools every day, and I'm constantly thinking about that. And what Kevin said about the realization that it can't just be a unit, that it needs to be the fabric of everything, from the curriculum to the policies to the schedule to, I think about it, that's the fabric. And I've really asked the folks that I've worked with now that I'm in a new role to really elevate that. And we're really looking deeply at all of our tools and resources to really be able to say, yeah, one of our guiding principles is indeed seek equity and justice. And that's one of our, what we say at Up for Learning. And are we truly demonstrating that in everything that we do? Is that woven into all of our programs, woven into how we operate both internally and externally? So I think that internal scan and that external scan is incredibly important, and it doesn't end. It's continuous.
I think that what you just mentioned about that weaving it into the fabric of your organization, I think that's really impressive. And I don't think I'm there yet, but I'm trying to be there. I do want to make a connection to our last webinar when we talked about student empowerment. And I know, Lindsay, you specialize in this, but on February 21st, we had a group of students at Main Street Middle School who were the driving force behind raising the Black Lives Matter flag, and which was awesome. And it was really student-centered work. But you can't, I don't think you can have that as one sort of event, right? And so what I had done was I had backed up to that moment, and we had talked about history and equity and different marginalized populations. And then we connected that to the Breaking Barriers, which is the Vermont History Day. And then we started talking about hidden history, and we ended up using, like Kevin was talking about, a lot of different resources. There's a really great podcast called Seen on Radio, and they have a whole episode. They have a whole season. It's called Seeing White, and they talk about all these different parts of our history where one part of the history is very much highlighted, where other maybe uglier parts where marginalized populations have been victimized is not highlighted. And so we talked about what it means to be a historian and the different perspectives that people have on these different events. And I thought it was really interesting. And not just for me, because the way it made me think about what we're teaching. And, so that when you look at Black Lives Matter, and if you go to their website, it specifically says we're seeking to end state-sanctioned violence, that's a heavy term, right? But when you start going back and connecting the historical events that come to why the raising the Black Lives flag matters so much, and kids can see that progression, I think it's, we talk about background knowledge for our academic work, but I think we need to build background knowledge for kids with our equity work. And that's creating sort of I hope that's creating a little bit of that fabric. So when we talk about student empowerment and we talk about equity, and then we talk about how do we start thinking about, Gorski talks about mitigating and moving that into transforming. Like, how do you start transforming your organization or your system so that these ideas of equity are woven into it? And that's something that I'm thinking about deeply as an educator. And the other issue, as Kevin mentioned, with all these literature groups, Gorski also says that equity concerns are intersectional. So you can't sort of just pick, one equity issue. You have to commit to equity for all marginalized populations, which I think is something that I'm thinking deeply about too, and how that's impacting my my teaching. So anyway, that's where I am, and that's how I've been thinking about it. And especially in relation to this idea of Vermont History Day and Breaking Barriers and Black Lives Matter, and trying to bring those together in a contextual and understandable way for students. Maura?
So I've been thinking in my role, thinking a lot about how to provide professional development that's really focused on equity and culturally sustaining pedagogy for our K-12 teachers. We're in our second year of a collaboration with Kathleen Brinegar and Dr. Hannah Miller from Northern Vermont University at Johnson, who've been amazing partners in this work. And we currently are all of our educators, K-12, are engaged in book clubs. We have 15 different titles, and we use circles as part of our process. And we've been digging in. People really, last year we really worked on an equity literacy framework, really thinking about identity and bias. And then this year we're really digging in using a lot of case studies. And that's also been really helpful because we're in our continuous improvement planning cycle. So we're planning for our next cycle. And so we've really been thinking about what does it mean to build an equitable continuous improvement plan? And what would that mean for our system? Like, where would we want to be in the next 5 years? And so that's been really central to a lot of the work and conversations that we've been doing. And as we think ahead, we're starting to play with ideas about participatory action research. How do we form partnerships and alliances within our community? And sort of how do we broaden and deepen our learning? And as an administrative team, we've been doing work with our teachers, and then we've also been doing work in addition to being with our teachers. And so we've been participating in courageous conversations. We've also been doing our own book group. And so we've been really thinking about what does it mean to help lead schools that are committed to equity. And so we're doing things like looking at policies, reviewing handbooks, really thinking about sort of how our schools are operating, and really sort of trying to look at all angles of our schools. And it's a work in progress, and it's messy, but it's work that we feel really committed to.
Maura, that sounds awesome. I just had a question. Like, when you talk about your continuous improvement plan, can you give me an example of like how equity would be woven into that, or like an equity-based goal that you would have that you wanted your group to accomplish in the 5-year window?
Yeah. So one of the things that we did that is part of the continuous improvement planning process that all schools go through is that you really dig in and you look at the data that you have. And so we spent a lot of time sort of disaggregating our data and also thinking about what data do we not have. And so part of our work this year is thinking about, do we have some goals specific to equity? But then beyond that, when we're thinking about what, because we have our goal statement and then we have some action steps and sort of identify our outcomes, we've been really intentional about what would it look like what would the data tell us, or what are some really specific action steps that we can use within a goal about, let's say, proficiency-based learning, for example, that would lead to more equitable outcomes for students. So, safe and healthy schools is a really big one. We have some specific equity action steps under a category like that. And so just really thinking about, what is our equity vision for our school? And then how does our action plan support that?
Awesome. That makes, I was looking at our continuous action plan, and I don't know if it has the equity woven that deeply into it. So that's great. Thank you very much for that. One of the things that we also wanted to talk about today, as many of you know, there's a pretty serious pandemic declared by the World Health Organization yesterday of COVID-19. It hasn't impacted Vermont perhaps as heavily as it's impacted some of the other regions of the United States. But, Vermont is, I think, in a fluid process of trying to figure out how to prepare for that and how to prepare for disruptions in our students' learning and sort of the school system as we're used to it. And so I guess one of the things that I consider with equity is, if there are disruptions to the school year or the educational process, what are some of the concerns or the considerations that you folks, that are on your radar that you think, we might want to be considering, or you would, say, hey, this is something, don't forget to think about this as we may move into a different sort of learning program, perhaps, hopefully everybody stays healthy, but just as things are changing, what are you thinking about, and what are your concerns for students relative to equity? And I'll let anybody take the lead on that one.
Well, I'm kind of, I think one of the most important things for myself is, and I believe I shared this with you all, is this like idea of how do we respond compassionately in a really uncertain time, and it's really day by day. I don't think we need to be. I think there's we already are dealing with a lot of heightened stress and anxiety about other things that are happening in our society. And on top of that, we have this new layer. So how are we going to respond differently in schools? What's it going to look like right now that's different than what we were doing yesterday? Are we taking time to connect with one another and be present with the adults and our students and hear what they have to say? And, I don't think we need to, it doesn't have to be the focus, attention, and the topic of the day, but I think just the bigger pieces around what are we doing to create a sense of belonging and care and support for one another in our school communities. And I think we just need to be taking it day by day. I mean, I think we don't know. I mean, 2 weeks from now, it might be back to business as usual. And 2 weeks from now, it might be something totally different. We don't know. Every day is different. We were just sharing before about the number of conferences and meetings that are being canceled because of large gatherings, and that's really unfortunate because those are really powerful opportunities for young people to come together with other young people from other schools, or just that network of learners, and sharing that enthusiasm and engagement and making change in our schools. And so how can we just be more present for ourselves, take care of ourselves, take care of our colleagues, and be really present for our students?
Thank you very much. Anybody else?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what Lindsay was saying, and this is the class that I teach at St. Mike's I had last night, and the students were made aware that learning might go online, and I had them at 5:15 last night, and so they had a full almost 24 hours of hearing this news, that news might be coming, and the stress and the tension that they were feeling was so it was so evident in sort of what they were presenting, and they were sharing how they were like, we don't want to talk about it. Can we just sort of go on? And so we took our time to check in, but then we also talked about content, and then did another check-in at the end, and this feeling of how can we, help youth to both think about how to manage their stress in a healthy way, but then also how can we be there for them and continue based on guidance that we have, how can we help to keep things going on track? Because I think, we also want them to have, some semblance of, getting their needs met at school, and that will look really different, for different students. I think one of the other things that's connected to that is the idea that, as we're trying to move in this very quickly shifting place, trying to think about, what would we do in the event that something would happen? And I think, it's important to be thinking about that as the adults, as teaching teams, be thinking about how are we going to be communicating with our students? How are we going to keep some sense of learning on track potentially? I've been doing a lot of work pulling resources about sort of what are the best ways to do that in emergency situations. And they talked about the importance for students to see and hear the voices of the adults from school that they know care about them when they're not in school. And so really thinking about, what are the strategies and the tools that you have to stay in communication with students in the event that you're not in school, and just to be there for them, because I think, that's really the most important.
Thank you very much. Kevin?
Yeah, I know, Don, going back to your question about like what are you hoping that people consider or think about? I was just talking to my buddy who teaches in New Hampshire, and they just had a meeting just about, again, that what might this look like if we have to, go to more of an online or flipped classroom setting. And their solution was, all right, well, we can figure out how to get all the kids Chromebooks. And I asked my buddy, I'm like, well, did they consider like everybody's Wi-Fi access at home? He's like, oh, like that didn't even come up. And that's what I worry about, is I feel like an easy answer is, oh, we'll just put everything online. And forgetting that a lot of these kids, don't have a device to bring home or Wi-Fi access at home. Or, when they're home, they're the caregiver of their family, have to take care of little siblings, or they're responsible for, putting the meals together. And, or maybe, certain kids, like the meals that they're getting are at school. So I think it's just, whatever happens, I really hope our school districts are really mindful and purposeful about addressing that, and not just saying, here's what's going to fix it. Here, we can just do this online. Because while that does work, it doesn't work for everybody. And then on a flip side, from an adult standpoint, which again wasn't on my radar until we just got this letter today from our CVEA executive board, and they put in a proposal, and I'm pretty sure it got accepted, to make sure that our hourly staff who would be affected, they don't have to take personal time, but it would come out of sick time instead. And it's, again, I don't know if, like, I'm hoping all districts are considering that, but that, like, for me, I was like, man, that was on my radar, because it's something very privileged and fortunate. I don't have to think about that, on a salary, but if you're an hourly staff, you might have to go 2 or 3 weeks without income. And what does that do to your family and their livelihood? So again, I just really hope that people are being really proactive about these conversations and not saying, well, let's just wait and see, but saying, all right, let's play out some scenarios and just make sure we have all of our ducks in a row, and make sure we're not leaving anybody out to dry who, would struggle the most, honestly, if this happened.
All of these are incredibly thoughtful responses, which is why I enjoy these conversations so much. And I guess I can tag on to so many of the things that people have talked about. One of the things that I'm starting to see it a little bit, but one of the things I started asking is, where do I sign up to volunteer? If things, if things get disrupted, how can I be volunteering or helping or creating a situation where I'm, offering that? I think Lindsay said, respond compassionately. How do we create systems where we have opportunities to do that? Because not only can that be helpful, but it can also make people feel really, positive and good, and build those relationships. The other thing that I was thinking a lot about is routines. Are there routines that we can establish so that, for example, if we do have kids with devices, can we be sending out an email at the same time every day? So, they get used to a pattern and they get used to a routine. And I think routines are really important for our kids, and just how do we build some new routines so that people know that we're just kind of continuing to do what we're continuing to do. And I guess this is a simple example, but one of the new routines we have now is kids come in, and as I'm taking attendance, we have one kid is like wiping the table. That's just kind of a new routine that we're doing, and it just becomes normalized. And so normalizing those things, and I think that helps. But the other thing that Maura talked about was communications. And I've been thinking about radio and maybe our podcast idea, if there's a way that we could be, can you broadcast? Because I'm starting the story, the Odyssey, and is there a way that I could be reading out loud, which is what I'm doing in class, and then broadcasting that, and so that, you know, I don't know if they would tune in, but okay, today's chapter of the Odyssey, you know, just kind of old school communications. And then the other piece I was thinking about was, is there a way that we could get a bunch of self-addressed envelopes or stamped envelopes? You know, the office has those, and so we give, you know, you give students a certain number of envelopes and say, okay, here's what I want you to be writing about, and then they, you know, then they can be kind of writing and journaling. So how do we kind of continue our learning and without maybe some of the technological aspects of it or some of the organizational elements of it? So those are things that I'm thinking about: routine, communication, and, you know, how can I help? One last thing before Lindsay, you know, Kevin, you just mentioned not thinking about the impacts on other people, and we probably don't understand and can never understand all the impacts individually this will have. So just being, again, to what Lindsay's point, super compassionate and empathetic, because we don't know how other folks are, you know, are responding. Lindsay?
Yeah, I was gonna say, even I think what is the maybe the biggest piece for me is not around, you know, how we're going to continue to ensure that, you know, that the curriculum is taught, but it's more like, how are young people going to get fed? How are young
Right.
people's mental health needs going to be met, and physical health needs going to be met, and how are we setting up systems and thinking about that? I think as an educational system, it might be really easy to go to, well, how are we going to go to like virtual learning, which is obviously brings up a whole lot of equity issues in itself. Let's not even go there, because I think we could list off like 100. And we don't often think about the role that a school serves for so many young people and other people. And so how are young people going to be fed? How are they going to have their needs met as far as their mental health and their physical health and you know, all those pieces? That to me seems like primary. Like we should, as a school, we should be, and I'm not in a school, but talking as a school, we should be thinking about that. What are we going to do if for some reason, you know, school closes? And I would ask Kevin, like, what did your school do in regard to those that rely on meals? I was only 2 days, and at the same time, that was 2 days of meals. Was there was there a strategy or a plan in place for how folks get fed?
I honestly don't know. So I think that says a lot too. I haven't heard Don from the administration. I'm assuming they had a plan, but again, that's not something that was communicated through us about like those specific things like you're saying. So I think it's a great point that you're making.
Right, and not to put you on the spot, because that, you know, you were told school's closed, right? And that's the messaging that you're receiving. And so probably the message to the community is school is closed. Do not come to the school. And there needs to be a plan in place for how we support our learners, our young people, so that we can make sure that basic needs are being met and health needs are being met.
Hey, Lindsay, I kind of want to tie also to what you said before about this fabric of equity, because as you were talking about food and mental health and the physical needs, and I'm asking myself, what's the role of schools in our community? You know, what is that role? And do we fully understand our role? Because sometimes we're so locked into, oh, my kid we need to be doing the curriculum, and we're not focused on the whole child. And perhaps we should be thinking more deeply about that whole child. And if we are thinking about the whole child, and, you know, how are we creating an equitable, you know, how is our schools as part of the community representing an equitable opportunity for all those kids around food, around mental health, around physical needs, around extracurricular opportunities? Because, you know, one of the big things for me is you're going to have the inequity is just going to be exacerbated if school is not happening. then you're going to have some kids who are going to have incredible opportunities to do things they wouldn't have been able to do if school was in session. And then you're going to have other groups of kids who are not, whose opportunities are going to be limited. And how are we going to address those as communities? And I don't have the answer to those, but that's my, when we have these times of disruption, how are we making sure that we're flexing out our opportunities for all students? And I'm not sure, I don't have an answer to that, but it's something I'm very concerned about. Maura, do you have any thoughts?
I think, I think Lindsay's point is right on. I think, we've been really thinking, our team convened on Monday to start thinking about things like meals, whether our nursing staff is available. The Agency of Education sent out some guidance on Tuesday, I believe, outlining the difference between a school closure where no one is at a school versus a dismissal where staff may still be in school buildings and providing services. We've been thinking about how do we support students who are on IEPs to make sure that their service needs are being met. What about our mental health clinicians? Are they going to be able to reach their students? And so, I think you want to be prepared. And so having these conversations now is, really important and helps to just, look at things in a way that maybe you never have had to think about and might impact things like how we think about snow days, like how are we, all these different things, or, we always have ice days or, we have weather events that happen. Are there ways that we can think differently about how we're meeting the needs of our larger community? We've also been thinking about geographically, some of our schools are in a village and some of our schools are not. So we are in a place where some people could walk to our building and we could reach families. Then we have other schools that's not an option. And so, how would we have to think about how we get resources out into the community? And so, I think having these conversations is really important and to start them, as soon as possible in the event that, either something in the near future happens, but I think it also helps us to consider what are things we need to have conversations about for the future, because these are things that, we just want to consider.
I agree with that. And I also want to just, again, point to one of Gorski's principles where he says we should not he goes, equity works are often driven by experts, like educational experts who come in and tell a community what they think should be happening. And he says not to overlook the power and perspective of the community. So as we're moving forward, my other question is, how are we incorporating the community into this work? So how are we, because here we are, planning, I think these kids need that and these kids need this, but are we going to be getting input and working with the community to figure out what resources they have and what their needs are and what they're thinking about? And so that's just something that makes my commitment to having the community be involved with what we're doing in the classroom when it's, when things are going on normally. What's happening now is making me realize how much more I have to work with the community and how much I have to figure out what those assets are and what they need from me, so that I can be serving them not only when things are routine, but also when you have these disruptions to potential disruptions to the learning. Any other thoughts or comments on that, or yeah, Lindsay?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the same thing when Maura was talking about this, how do we, it's really not effective when it's a small group of folks sitting in a room making decisions for a community. And because they might not be the right decisions that are being made and really addressing the needs of all the different stakeholders. And I was just thinking how that applies to even just like, I was working with a youth adult team from a middle school and a high school today around, they're doing a 90-day, youth participatory action research project on how they can make their schools so that all individuals feel a sense of belonging and connection, and inclusive schools. And so through the lens of restorative, or through the, I guess, the fabric of restorative practices. And what I'm trying to get at is that they're tasked with collecting creating ways to have dialogue with all the different stakeholder groups, community members, students, faculty, staff, so that everyone's voice is part of the process. And yes, it takes more time to do that, but it's time that's well spent, because if just a few individuals make decisions in a closed office somewhere, there's a likelihood that that decision's not going to go over so well, or it's not going to really address the root cause, or the root issue, the root of it, and or the needs that need to be addressed. So these teams are going back to their schools thinking about how can we collect data from all the different stakeholder groups, and by data I mean have dialogue to create, to collect information.
I mean, I think that's really, really important. And so, I mean, like you've heard on the news and in current events, we're in sort of a fluid situation. Hope for the best. I think people need to be preparing and thinking about equity and how all of our students and community members are going to be impacted. Does anybody have any kind of closing comments? One thing I just, maybe we PLP Pathways may want to have, maybe we could have a small webinar if things change and it's a fluid situation. Maybe we could get together and just provide some resources for people, or another brainstorming session, or things that we've heard, and pass those along so that, other teachers, if the situation changes, maybe could use some of those resources or ideas for their own whatever work they're doing. But again, it's an interesting situation right now. Does anybody have any final thoughts or ideas? If not, I want to thank the Tarrant Institute and the Middle Grades Collaborative for all their work in supporting our work. And I also, I just hope that, wish everybody the best. I'll be in touch with you. And again, it's a fluid situation. I think the message that I'm taking from today's webinar is that idea of we have to be really compassionate with our kids and really caring, and making sure that we're supporting them as much as possible, because I think, as Lindsay said, perhaps I know there is an extra level of anxiety or uncertainty. And so, just being calm, compassionate, and supportive, I think, is really important for our colleagues and for our children and for everybody else who relies on school as such an essential part of the community. Okay, so thanks very much, everybody. I will be in touch, and I hope you stay safe, healthy, and we'll see you soon. Okay, have a good afternoon, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.